Okay, so first question is, while we hope this webinar is valuable, there is a kind of doubt here that any kind of one-off event like this would actually qualify as good CPD. So what do you think? Can you learn and put into practice something just from coming to a webinar or tweeting or whatever it is you do with social media? What do you think? Feel free to write something in the chat. So what we know is that effective CPD has at least 5 characteristics, and here they are. So obviously it should have a very strong content focus on what it is that you're trying to teach. And a webinar or workshop, yes, that's perfectly possible. Second, because implementation and change are hard, it's reckoned that in general you need kind of several teachers in the department to be working on this, so there's more chance of success. And that's where a webinar workshop, you think, well, maybe, maybe not, because there's not a lot of collective participation going on here. Third, active learning. Obviously, we're pretty sold on this idea that learners actually construct things for themselves out of what they actually do and think about what they're doing. And there's a limited amount of that, probably for time reasons, in a webinar or workshop. And then you get on to the rather negative aspects, which are coherence, which means, does it fit into a bigger picture? Is it part of something kind of structured, not just like a one-off little detail? And it's hard to do that in a short, one-off event. You really need something that's got a kind of overall structure, and you're going to take little bits at each stage. And that relates to the final characteristic. Duration matters, right? As you know, with any kind of habit or change, you do something once, you're likely to go back to what you were doing before. And that's typically what goes on with a webinar workshop. So we're pretty happy that we've done, some useful things in the last 5 webinars. People have liked them, but we're conscious that that probably isn't going to change very much. And we're a bit more ambitious because we're doing this so that things change. So we have an idea that we might upgrade this experience into more of a masterclass. And if you like that idea, at the end of this webinar, you'll have a chance to influence what might go in it. Okay, so handing over to Gemma now.
Okay, hello. So I'd like to introduce you to John. He is our head of department, and he's using the Activate course for Key Stage 3, which is a very popular course. And his students have just done their 2019 GCSEs, and he's got the results. And he's pretty upset to see that quite a few students didn't do too well on the AO2 question, so that's applying their knowledge. So what he did is he looked at the papers to try and figure out what was going on. And he found one question that a lot of students found very difficult, and that's what we're calling the orchid question. So here's the question. I'll just give you a few seconds to read through it if you're not familiar with it. It is from one of the 2019 papers. So while you're reading through, if you can think about kind of the concepts that the students will need to understand in order to answer it. So basically, John decided to set this question in the mock exams for his new cohort of Year 11s. And then he asked a couple of his students to talk through how did they tackle that question? What kind of knowledge and skills did they use to try and figure out and answer that question? So he asked one of his students, we're going to call the student A, who is a low AO2 performer. So basically the student didn't get very many marks on that question. So he asked them what caused this then? What caused the change of the yellow orchids, or the orchid plants to have yellow flowers and changed into purple flowers? And And the student here, this is his answer. They became purple because bees prefer brighter colours. So this particular student, he's not looking for a theory like natural selection to explain the evolution, to explain what's going on. So he's kind of drawing on some ideas that he may have already. He might have picked these ideas up from a very young age to try and explain what's going on. So really, he's not thinking about what could have caused it. He's not thinking along the theme of cause and effect. So he can't explain what's going on. So then he asked another student, we're going to call these a high AO2 performer, and she got quite a few of the marks, asked the same question. So you can see here, she is thinking about cause and effect. She's noticed that the question is about evolution. I mean, there's a massive clue in the question. It does say that. And then she's remembered that that is actually a process. And she's thinking about what could have caused that change. And thinking along the lines of natural selection, what steps are taking part. And she knows it's because those purple plants must have had an advantage. And that is why we see this change. Okay, so student A then. So let's look at another reason why they didn't do very well. And that's because of a lack of deep and connected understanding. So this is what he is saying happened. He knows it's something to do with the bees visiting the plants. He may remember something about pollination, but he doesn't have a deep understanding of the concept of evolution. So he can't draw on information, connected information to explain what's going on. So he's not linking key concepts together in any way. And we say that he hasn't built a useful schema. So he's not seeing links between adaptation, resources, pollination, competition, natural selection. All of these things, students have to have a very deep understanding, and they have to be able to link them together in order to answer a question like that. And for those of us who are experts, science experts, it's very difficult to actually understand how difficult a question like that is for a student. So student B then, straight away, as I said, she's recognised it's natural selection, and she's actually remembered the stages of natural selection. She knows it's a process, and she knows this because of the way she's been taught it in a lesson. She remembers those processes, and therefore she knows she has to explain each one in order to answer the question. So let's go back. Let's have a look at a reminder of the question then, and this is actual student A's full answer. So this is what they've done. And in order to answer this question, they have to be able to explain what's happening with a model. So you can see that he hasn't got that clear model in his head about those 4 stages of natural selection. He might have some of them. So he knows some of the orchids have purple flowers. He's kind of thinking about variation, kind of thinking about competition there. But because that model's not very clear, he's finding it very difficult to construct a good answer, a well-defined answer. Whereas student B then, she has this model very clear in her mind, and therefore she can construct her answer following this model. So there she's given a full answer, and she's got all the points that she needs for those 4 marks. So by doing this kind of analysis, then John, our science teacher, realises that students, in order to answer these kinds of questions, they need to have 3 kinds of knowledge. The first is science ideas, which is probably the most obvious. They need deep understanding of key concepts. But what maybe is not so obvious is they need connections between these key concepts so they can bring them all together to answer a complex question. They also need inquiry skills. So the one we've noticed here is they need to be able to explain with models, and they need to have an understanding of themes. They need to link cause and effect. So that exercise then told him the importance of inquiry skills. So students can think with these skills when they're answering a question. So here's just some of the skills that your students will need. And this is taken from our Blueprint 5-year plan. And this is where we've taught those skills in year 7. So you can see we've covered all the skills, and some of them we've used more than once in these concepts. Themes might not be so familiar to you, and John didn't realise there were underlying themes as well. And we think of these as kind of like the hidden game of doing science. It's really how to think like a scientist. So they're things that you can use to help you think in the right way. So, for example, in physics, if you're coming across a situation to do with forces or energy, you're thinking about systems. So you're immediately thinking about what objects to consider and what objects I can ignore in that system. And in chemistry and particularly biology, the hidden game is often looking for a relationship that you're linking structure and function together. So once you understand how to do these themes, then a lot of the questions become easier to answer because you're constantly looking with how you can answer these questions. And they run right across science. So they link the different strands of science, biology and chemistry and physics together. So for example, if you understand energy and matter theme, you can use that in physics when you talk about energy transfer, but you can also use it in biology when you're talking about feeding relationships. Now, we've taken these from the US standards, or the NGSS. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that, but they do teach very much according to these themes, and it's not something that's very evident in UK schemes of work. But to use them, teachers need to make them very explicit when they teach every key concept, so students become good at spotting them and, if you like, playing the game. So John then thinks about, well, how does his Key Stage 3 course then equip his students with these kinds of knowledge so they can answer the AOT questions? So he looks back at where natural selection was taught, first at Key Stage 3. So as I said before, he was using Activate. So there are problems here with all three kinds of knowledge. The science ideas, students get a general overview, but there's no real detailed example of natural selection that they can make sense of. So in the first task, they're asked to put organisms in order of how they're evolved, which is a very difficult task if they have no prior knowledge. And then the teacher actually just tells them what natural selection and what adaptation is. They're shown this flowchart in the textbook. These are the stages of natural selection, but they're not actually linked to any real example. An abstract without concrete is not a very effective way of learning. In fact, it results in rote learning. So those students might be able to remember the stages of natural selection, but if you ask them to apply that to an unfamiliar situation, like the orchids question, they're going to find that very difficult to do. Inquiry skills. So we said here it's about using a theory or model to explain, and that's not dealt with at all here, and neither is the theme. So there's no sense of evolution being a causal mechanism in this lesson at all. So he looks at other schemes of work then, see if there's anything better. This is from Smart Learning, and it is better. There's an example at the start, which is a concrete example about polar bear evolution. It doesn't really give you a lot of time. They're given 5 minutes here, not really a lot of time to sort of reveal their understanding if they've got any misconceptions. And in the main activity, again, they are told the stages of natural selection, and then they just apply that to the polar bear. So they're not forming any ideas of their own there. And again, we're going to get rote learning, we're going to get shallow understanding, not deep understanding that they need. And again, no real focus on skills or themes there either. And the final one is, this is from Collins. This is lower secondary, they're Cambridge, which is actually international syllabus. And quite a few ways it's better than the last one again. Students get some more support on making sense of the theory of evolution. They're actually given a simulation to do where they act something out. So we've got a bit of active learning going on. But it's very difficult. What they do is they use different tools to pick up rice and beans. And it's very difficult then to apply that to a real life situation again. So we're not sure if they're going to be able to link that with the actual theory. And of course, again, no real link with skills or theme there either. So you can see the general problem. So John concludes then that none of the schemes of work from the publishers that he's seen or the one he's using at the moment, really give students adequate preparation for AOT questions. So his next thing to think about is, what can he do? And that's back to Tony.
Thanks, Gemma. So I think this is a fair summary of what acquire, this stage where the students get the big idea into their head, has to do in such a way that students are kind of prepared for being able to answer unfamiliar questions later. So there are 5 things that we've identified. They really have to be thinking about explaining with their tool. You can think of the concept as a tool for explaining. Of course, the main focus is the science and in-depth understanding. And then third, we want, as Gemma said, to connect related ideas, and that they've had a chance to connect things they learned previously with what's coming new. And then 4, we want, of course, to give as much attention to the inquiry skill as we can. There might be many skills. We're going to try and foreground one of them to do some teaching, and of course bring in others that are relevant. And then the 5th requirement is really that we are explicit about this hidden game of science, whether it's a system, a model, cause and effect. We want students to recognize this as an example of a way of scientific thinking which they're going to get into by practice and exposure over time. Okay, so the place to start when you're designing such an acquire lesson, of course, is to have some clear learning objectives. This is an extract from the new version, which has not yet been published, a blueprint. It's evolved because previous versions that we put in front of teachers tended to get the result of, well, if I use your objectives and here's a lesson I design, does it look any different to what I did before? Often the answer was no. So we thought, well, obviously not enough clear direction on what does need to be different. So here are some new features in this planner that I'll draw out. The first obvious one is in the red elliptical things. You've got the 3 kinds of knowledge. So top, you've got the science ideas, and then you've got the theme there, cause and effect, and the inquiry skills. So they're all up there in front. And then you probably notice there is some kind of hierarchy there going on, and some icons. So we better explain what they are. Basically, if you've read our stuff on big ideas, which was in reading for the webinars, you'll have realized that it's this causal understanding that's central to students being able to explain unfamiliar phenomena, right? These are the difficult things, the principles, the theories of science that take a long time to be grasped, right? And basically, if they take a long time, you're going to have to devote a lot of teaching time to those, and by implication, less teaching time to other things. And we think one of the fundamental errors that people have made in planning courses before is to basically give everything equal weight. You know, it's got 1 line in the syllabus, 1 double page spread in the book, 1 lesson. That kind of thinking, I would have done that myself 20 years ago, is a kind of knee-jerk response, but it isn't terribly smart, because it doesn't reflect the kind of knowledge structure that we've already described. So really most of the teaching time has to go on getting that understanding. That's priority number 1. And so priority number 2 are the more descriptive ideas and skills, and then priority number 3 in small type, the details. They're all important, but what matters is that details and descriptive ideas don't need to be understood in such depth. So they don't need so much time. So if you actually decide what they are and what the big idea is, you're actually doing students a favor, because you now know how to focus your lesson to get the most important things done best. Okay, the other feature here are these icons. Why are we telling you all these different kinds of knowledge? Well, you might have got a clue already that knowledge is not all the same. A model or a theory is not the same as a principle. Let's say Newton's second law is a principle. It's a relationship between different variables, and you have to mathematize it, don't you, in turning it into a formula and doing quantitative thinking. So there's two types, and then there's natural selection, which is a process. It's a set of stages. And then there are concepts, which are categories of things, could be abstract as well. So there are kind of four different kinds of idea, and then there's facts, which are details. And if you treated them as the same and taught them in the same way, again, you probably wouldn't be helping students as much as if you thought, okay, it's a model. A model has actors, these things, particles or electrons, and they have various properties and behaviors. Let's introduce it like that. And if we know what each actor and property is, then we've got a hope of communicating that to the students. So it's horses for courses, different strategies for different kinds of knowledge. And the same is true with the inquiry skills and themes and techniques and skills. Now, John, who's lucky enough, of course, to take one of our masterclasses, has another realization, which is that an AO2 question that he's been puzzling over for ages now is actually science in miniature. What do I mean? Well, at the beginning is a phenomenon, this orchid, and how it's different and related to previous orchids. That's a phenomenon. And the question is basically asking you to develop a theoretical explanation. Phenomena, explanations. Essentially, that's what science is about. I've taken a bigger leap here and suggested that scientists basically carry out these 7 stages, which are cunningly named because we're using those in the same structure in our Acquire lesson. But I think you will agree when I describe them that they do describe essentially what scientists do. First, they find a problem they want to research. That's called engage. And then in the enable stage, of course, they look around and see what scientists already know. This is research of other people's theories. Once they put that into perspective, then they can plan their own experiment or other investigation to understand the phenomenon themselves or test a hypothesis, which leads to explain, developing a theory to account for the results. And finally, the reason why they did it, with that theoretical framework, they can make sense of the phenomenon that they were interested in researching at the beginning. So if they have a theory now, they can now use it in different situations. And finally, they can see if they've kind of got on the right track, check for their own understanding. So that's what scientists do. Why couldn't students do something similar? It may not be as crazy as it sounds because, according to some researchers, that's the kind of model that understanding progresses towards. So you start off with events, concrete things that you've seen in your mind, and gradually you turn those into a more abstract and a theoretical representation. That is actually the way that maths in the recommended form from Singapore is taught now. Very concrete, turn it into pictures, make it more symbolic and abstract. That does seem to reflect the way our mind works. So we think there is some validity in this structure. And possibly most important, without some kind of structure, not necessarily this one, we're not quite sure how it is you'd be able to remember to build in all the important factors in learning anyway. So for us as designers, it really helps to have some boxes and some requirements in each box to make sure we do sensible things. But the real proof, of course, is what does it look like? So we thought the best way would be to show you an example how we've taught natural selection in our materials. You can see that we looked at all the other publishers' schemes first to see what they were doing well and not so well, and we can therefore try and do better. These are being used now in a number of schools. We may even have a few teachers here are using it at the moment, so you can get some live feedback. But generally, the impression is that they are quite effective in getting a deep understanding, because that's how they were designed. So, stage by stage, here is a quick tour. So, engage, first stage. We're trying to set up something that's puzzling. We want students to raise the question in their own minds so that they're actually the ones who want to figure it out. And then the rest of the lesson is essentially a pathway towards getting an answer to that puzzling phenomenon. But along the way, we uncover this key concept that acts as a tool so we can explain. And I just think it's worth contrasting here the approach. So if you use the activate style, delivery of knowledge, I'm afraid, it's not very reliable in doing what psychologists call transfer, which means you've got some knowledge, you can apply it to all the situations that you're ever going to be asked about. We know that's very hard, right? And the typical approach doesn't tend to do that very well. What we're looking for is an approach that creates this richer schema, framework in your mind where all the concepts and themes and skills are connected. And that is what's going to give you the ability to transfer, to recognize a new situation and the underlying features of that situation, that it's about cause and effect, that it's about a model that triggers the actual model that you need and the related concepts. That's what allows you to do the orchid question. So this is the kind of lesson we want. And our basic philosophy is, if you want that, then as Keith Tabor, who's a Cambridge academic who works on constructivism, says, read this: if students observe natural phenomena for themselves, especially ones that might appear counterintuitive, then there's a motivation to develop an explanation which involves the construction of some theory, right? Now, we shouldn't forget motivation, because thinking is a motivational act, they say. In other words, you don't have to think. If you don't want to think, no one's going to make you think. You can sit there, you can act like you're doing the work, you look like you're engaged, but that's just behavioral. If you're not actually, using various parts of your brain to make connections, you're not thinking, you're not learning very much. So you do have to have some motivation. What could that be in this case? Well, this is a very contextualized example. You don't have to do it exactly this way, but I happen to have been to Indonesia. I don't know if you have, but it's incredible that you see these dwarves and giants. It would be great to take my students there, but budgets probably don't allow that. So we came up with this idea of, okay, just imagine your school's won a competition, the class has gone out there, you show them a slideshow of some of the amazing creatures that they would see on a visit, or you go somewhere else and look at some other creatures, it doesn't really matter. But you come up with some really puzzling things, like giant rats or dwarf elephants or Flores man. And then the students have something to explain, something that's worth them thinking about. And then we introduce the lesson objectives, which is cueing them to realizing it isn't just about, these creatures, not just about the concrete stuff here. There is an abstract dimension to this. We want to figure out how species and why species change, and we want to explain things. So that takes us into the real beginning of the science here. We're not going to throw students in and say, figure it out for yourselves. Right? That's obviously not how learning works. So we're going to provide them some of the basic concepts and details so they can think with them. So in this case, we will do some slides. This is direct instruction, breaking things down to very small pieces. We will give them the background information, the details, and the simpler concepts, the ones you saw there in the beginning, descriptive ideas and facts. But we're not going to attempt to say, oh, by the way, here are the 4 stages that Darwin worked out. These are called natural selection. We're not going to give them that right now. Why not? because you simply can't communicate it from one mind to another. Learning doesn't work like that. If you want to know more about that, that's the kind of thing we would do in a masterclass. But it's just impossible for a student to make sense of that. And I'll show you some research in a minute. So what we're talking about are the kind of things that you could use a slide and direct instruction to deliver, or even a simple activity. And we put those into students' minds first, because that will allow them to actually do the exploring that's the heart of this lesson. And this means giving them time to make sense of this phenomenon so they can actually see some of the relationships. We're not asking them to figure out, relativity in half an hour. What we're asking them to do is to notice things. We're preparing them for the theory to come. Now, I thought I would do a bit of research here, because you might just say, well, this is all kind of whatever you believe, and we believe something different. Who knows best? There's a load of different research that goes on. It's been going on for like 40 years that suggests that students actually need some kind of preparatory work to make the best use of the explanation, the telling part of the lesson, whatever you call it. Productive failure, time for telling, invention tasks. There's masses of papers I can direct you to. I'm going to choose just one example because it's quite telling here. And that is, so this is Schwartz and his colleagues who looked at 3 different ways of teaching something, right? So first way would be you read something in the book, you summarize, that sounds very active, and then you hear the lecture on the principles. Sounds perfectly reasonable. Group 2, they're doing a different approach. This time, before they hear anything, they look at some data. So if this was natural selection, they might look at animals and frequencies and populations and whatever. And then they get the lecture about how the stages of evolution work. Group 3, as a kind of control, they're doing even more work on the data at the beginning, and they don't get any of the theoretical lecture. So could they have figured it all out for themselves? What do you think you found? Anyone prepared to guess? No state secrets, I can't hear you. These are the results. So very clearly, group 2, the ones who had both, did better than either of the others. And importantly, it was this order that they actually did some work themselves to make sense of the data. You can imagine as they were doing that, they were coming up with ideas, wondering what might be causing those differences. Because you don't need to be a genius, you can see the differences in the data, but you can start talking about them. And then you're kind of ready, aren't you? You've got some of that background knowledge, and then when you hear the lecture on the principles, it makes sense. We've all been to lectures where we don't have any background knowledge, and it doesn't make any sense. So how do we do this? We're going to view a few slides from the activity so you can see some of the important details. So this is the beginning of the explore. So we tell students that Foster, who's a scientist, he came to this idea of an island rule, the fact that species on islands that are separated from the mainland often get bigger or smaller. And we've shown them some data in a previous slide on that. And we're asking them to figure out for themselves why. So it's a kind of invitation to be like Darwin, right? But we don't care if they get it right or wrong. It doesn't matter. The only point is that they've started to think about it. And this is where we can introduce some inquiry skills, because we call this a hypothesis, and they have to come up with an explanation, effectively develop a model, and we're going to then introduce Darwin's model later. But what we then get them to do is a kind of souped up version of the simulation you saw in the, I think it was the Collins lesson earlier. So instead of just putting tweezers into a pot of beans, we think be much more purposeful if you've got students to play out the process of evolution. We've adapted something we found where you can have 3 different kinds of organisms. They compete with each other for limited resources, and then you can see what happens generation by generation. You can collect data, and then the students have all of this sort of background knowledge from which you can then say, okay, what does it all mean? This is explain. So once they're ready, you have a perfect opportunity for presenting the theory, because you can build on the concrete experience that they already have and turn that into some abstract rules. You can introduce the stages of evolution or natural selection one by one, because you can take the concrete simulation example and sort of abstract from that what's actually happening in that stage. It's not a big leap for the students to make, and you can show them the 4 stages quite quickly. Okay, so this is explain. Having got all that theory in place, right, the payoff is that you can use that concept to explain the thing at the beginning that was so puzzling. And we do that with giant rats. So we've kind of explained elephants already. So we said to the students a problem of, well, there are these giant rats on the island. How did they get to be so big? And with a bit of scaffolding in a worksheet, they can probably use those stages now to work out what would have happened. So that's the sort of problem and solving the problem using the methods of science. We're not claiming that that would have covered all the knowledge that you want students to have. So there's this extra stage here where you can now connect additional knowledge to this strong framework you've already built and give them new situations. And then we can do that with questions like, you know, imagine what would happen if you had these fossils. Could you explain something? All kinds of stuff you could do before the final stage, which is obviously some kind of formative assessment. And this is an exit ticket focused on the learning objectives. So I want to quickly wrap up this now. There is a summary of the 7 stages, which I hope we've given some justification for. And this would be a lesson or even 2 lessons, but it is possible to do a potted version in 1 lesson. So now back to John. John has tried this. And he wants to know whether it's working. And we thought you would be very unlikely to believe a stock photo image. So we have got a real teacher here to tell you what he's done. I think it's time for me to stop for a brief pause. If anybody's got some questions, Gemma?
Well, we're just discussing about how Blueprint can actually help you to fit in everything you need to cover. In the 5 years, so there is some concern about actually fitting in time to teach like this. So I don't know if you've got a quick kind of overview of Blueprint and what it is and how it can help. Tony?
Sorry, microphone. I'll try that again. We have got some proof internally, which we've only shown in workshops, that you can do a sort of time estimate of each topic for the whole year, for all the 5 years, and there are 105 key concepts. And provided that you prioritize them in the way we've done, there is enough time over 5 years. The reason you might not have enough time now is because you're probably repeating lots of things and you're probably not getting the benefit of mastery. So one of the things we discussed in another webinar is that, you know, when students learn things to a higher degree the first time, they don't require so much reteaching later. So we're covering quite a lot of things in Key Stage 3 that you would have left till Key Stage 4. Does that help?
I think the main concern is if we're covering a lot of stuff at Key Stage 3, how can we make sure they don't forget it by the time they do their exams at the end of Year 11?
Retrieval practice, interleaving, all these things you know about, Gemma. And you use lots of different techniques to keep revisiting the same thing. And, you know, that is very good practice to do. But you don't need to reteach it. You just need to keep coming back to it and checking that they can still remember it and use it in a new situation.
For example, for this natural selection, we have a unit in Year 11 which revisits evolution. So we're teaching some of the stuff at GCSE about the evidence for evolution. We also include into that unit classification. So they will have to use their knowledge of natural selection again. But we, as Tony said, we wouldn't be reteaching the theory of natural selection. It'll be a quick recap and activate at the start of a lesson, just to check they've got that prior knowledge before we build on it.
And I would also say that it's a matter of strategy here, okay? So you might say, I'm not sure there's enough time to do it your way. Well, I would say, how good is your way? Teaching everything twice, in general, according to the evidence, produces an average score in GCSE 25%, right? Not very impressive. And we know the reasons why it isn't, because students have lots of inert knowledge. They've been taught too quickly the most important things that they didn't have time to grasp. And the only kind of thing that you might argue is, well, there'll be some details that you don't have time to finish in the 5 years. And I would say, well, that's where cramming comes in. That's where you can add knowledge later. Once you've got a firm foundation of understanding, it's much easier to learn facts and details. When you can't connect that to anything, you can spend as much time as you like trying to cram it, but it still won't last more than a week. So I think if you adopt this approach, you would see the benefits accumulating. But I'm only the theory, right? You talk to the teachers who are doing it. They're telling us things, as I hope to show you now, that students are getting it better. So at this point, I'm going to switch to Gary, who, unfortunately, because he's got a meeting today, can't be here to do it. He did record this commentary, so I'm going to play this, and he'll tell you what happened in his experience of mastery. If there's anybody in this webinar who's also been doing it, you can tell us honestly what you've been finding. Here we go.
Hello, my name is Gary Talbot, and I've been a science teacher for over 10 years now. I currently work at a school in Lancashire, but previous to the current job, for the last 6 or 7 years, I worked at the Co-op Academy in Orchid, which is in Salford, Manchester. We were one of the biggest schools in Salford with roughly around 1,300, 1,400 secondary school pupils. The approach we used to teach science was very content and knowledge based, and based on the old specifications. Exams were very, very content driven and knowledge driven. So we taught like that. We tried to get in skills as much as possible, but what we did was, as a lot of schools did, or currently do, we taught Key Stage 3 science with the biology, chemistry, physics, and then we taught a lot of that stuff again at Key Stage 4 over 3 years, and just obviously in a little bit more depth. And what we were finding was that by the end of year 11, or in year 11 when it came to exams time, our pupils were slightly disengaged, because they'd learned a lot of the stuff at Key Stage 3, and then they'd done it again at Key Stage 4, year 9 and 10, and then we're revising it again in year 11. Just because they were revising it more didn't necessarily mean that they understood it more. So we with the new exam specification, we found that the results started to suffer, because the pupils weren't prepared to answer the AO2, the AO3 skills, just because we were trying to get through as much content as possible over the 3 years as we could. So it was hard to really delve into concepts and apply them to different situations, just because of the time. So what we did was we tried to look around for something new which would try and address this AO2, AO3. We looked on the Education Endowment Foundation website on their toolkit, and we looked at mastery learning as a possibility, because that adds, according to their research, about 3 to 4 months progress. And we came across the complete mastery curriculum. I'd done some work with Tony and the mastery team in the past on other projects, and really enjoyed it, and I knew that the stuff they wrote was really engaging and thought-provoking. And also I used to teach a lot of the science update stuff, if you remember that. Again, people really enjoyed that stuff and those activities, and teachers enjoyed using those resources as well. So we invited the mastery team in to do a sort of one-day introduction. We had staff from other schools invited, and we sent two of our own staff to see what it was about. They came out really, really inspired about the mastery approach, and they sold it to the rest of the science team, and then we all agreed to try it, starting with our year 7. So we rolled it out a couple of years ago to our year 7, and what we found was, for our pupils and teachers, there was a massive change. So firstly, instead of teachers just delivering curriculum really, really quickly and kind of telling pupils the answers, teachers started to actually encourage students to find stuff out themselves. The good thing about the mastery stuff is it's very context based, so there was always a scenario that pupils were working out, which they really enjoyed. And because it's over 5 years, as opposed to 2 years Key Stage 3 and 3 years Key Stage 4, we found that we could actually delve into topics and content a lot more, and we could apply it to lots of different situations, and that helped pupils to understand and deepen their thinking and deepen their knowledge and develop the skills. So we have more time to do practical stuff and really look at the AO3, the AO2 stuff in the practical, reading graphs and coming up with improvements for experiments, etc. So we started to do this with our year 7s, and then the year after we did it with our year 8s. We started to use the mastery concepts of assessing, pre-assessment, diagnostic assessment, assessment at the end, and it was actually helping us to understand whether pupils had really understood it before moving on to the next topic, and helped us to reteach stuff if they didn't understand it. Whereas in the past, we would go 3 or 4 weeks teaching a topic and then testing it at the end, and by then it was too late to go back and teach the stuff they'd not understood. We'd obviously have to move on because of the time. So the 5 years really, really benefited us. In terms of students and pupils, we felt that pupils were a lot more engaged, and that was particularly the case for our lower ability pupils. They really enjoyed the sort of scenarios and context stuff of the mastery. And as well, with low abilities, sometimes some of the teachers had quite low expectations, and they wouldn't necessarily teach sort of really hard concepts. And we found that the low ability pupils actually really enjoyed that. As long as we scaffolded it as much as possible, they really enjoyed pushing themselves, and it was kind of exciting to see that in the pupils. We also, because we had more time to delve into the concepts, we found that the low ability pupils were picking up those complicated concepts a lot better than they did previously. And we actually found that when we gave year 7 pupils GCSE questions, they could actually do them better than the year 11s, because they'd actually spent more time thinking about it and deepening the knowledge and skills, as opposed to year 11s where it was just sort of rush through and content driven. So the school and all continue to do that, and they're going to carry on until it's obviously over 5 years. The current school that I'm at, we've also looked at mastery because we had the same problems there in terms of the curriculum being over 2 years and 3 years, and it rushed and people not being able to do the AL2, AL3. So we've decided also after Christmas to roll it out with year 7 and year 8 and see how it goes. So we're hoping that it'll have the same sort of success as it did in my previous school at the Co-op Academy Walkden. And that's it really. Thanks very much and goodbye.
Thanks, Gary. So I think it's time to return to our question that we discussed at the beginning. Hopefully, after you've seen the 7Es and thought about acquiring these different kinds of knowledge, you might have something to say about these different ways of teaching, because these are the kind of fashionable debates that are going on, which don't really get us very far. But what can we say about these different methods? Have you seen them in the 7 E's that I've shown you? What do you think? Let's have a little bit of chat. If anybody's very daring, you can even request to speak, and I will give you the floor. We have a taker, Margaret. I don't know if Margaret's still online. No, she's disappeared. So if anybody wants to say something, you can chat, of course. You can press the hand button and request to speak, or just put your ideas in the chat. Okay, well, I won't belabor this. Our view is that any simple questions like these are missing the point, that these are all important ingredients in teaching. The most critical factor is whether you know how to use them, when to use them, when they work, how to adapt them. This kind of thing is what matters, and we've been trying to do that in our stages. And
we have a request speaker.
Oh, I missed that. Let's go for it. Janet. Oh, it's not quite working as I expected. Unfortunately, I press the button and nothing happens. Can we try once more? Janet, Margaret, if you can press that thing one more time. It just doesn't seem to work. We might have to leave that. So we want to leave you with something that you can do next. If you want to try this out, if you're intrigued whether it might actually improve students' understanding, we will give you access after today to one free topic, but it may not be the one you need to teach next. So you can get any of the individual topics from our course. Over the next week, they're going to be on special offer. And with that, you get everything. So you get the activate, the acquire, the analyze, the assess, and the test, everything that you need really to test it out. And most importantly, you get some data from the students about whether they've understood it, which will allow you to know whether it was actually any good. I did say that there would be a masterclass coming, and what we'd like to do is to invite you to think of any topics, if you're interested in this, that you'd like to see featured. We want to do things that are valuable and provide some kind of insight into how to do them and why they work from research and design point of view. So please feel free to brainstorm some ideas, and then we will put together a survey to choose the ones that would form the content for next term. So please do tell us what you'd really like to know. And finally, there's also going to be an advert next week. If you're interested in doing some writing, we're going to be looking for some writers of questions. So that's something to be on the lookout for. That is all we wanted to say. We'll leave this open for a little while so you can ask each other any questions or ask us things. Feel free to stay and chat. Gemma, anything you'd like to add?
We've had a few comments about the direct instruction versus guided inquiry. Quite a few people thinking guided inquiry and active learning is a really good idea. But of course, we also know that direct instruction has its place as well, and we use it in certain points in our lessons as well. So maybe a mixture is best.
Right. I would say that we are using a form of direct instruction a lot of the time. We break things down very carefully, but we're always on the lookout for what students can do to think themselves. And I should say that all the stuff on direct instruction came from research done on teaching little children how to read, right? And we're teaching big children how to think scientifically. So you might well question whether direct instruction would be the right thing to do all of the time. I'll leave it there. So do keep chatting, and please give us some ideas for the masterclass and any feedback you'd like. Thank you so much for coming. I hope that's been of as much value as you can expect from a webinar. And we will be offering something in more depth for those of you who want it. Take care.